In this video, we will learn how to build our random quote machine. I believe this was the first project that was available when I started Free Code Camp, and it's a good one that demonstrates how you can start using functions in a browser setting in a way that is not just within a JavaScript console. So that's essentially the goal here and a skill that we will be practicing. I went ahead and copied the two user stories that is required for this project. We want to click on a button to generate quotes and also to tweet out a quote. So in starting a larger project, the first thing, or the way to start is generally from the back end into the front end. And in this case, it's really from the JavaScript into the HTML and CSS. So this first part will focus mostly on getting the actual functionality and just displaying it on a blank HTML page, and then we'll work on styling it, and then finally we'll add in the extra feature of tweeting out a quote. So these are the first two steps, but it's obviously much more complicated than just these two things. The first thing we want to think about is the data structure we are dealing with. That is really our first chief task. So the data structure is what type of data we are working with and how we want to, well, structure it. In this case, it is a data structure of quotes. So what does that mean? Well, we can have, an array of quotes, such and such. But for me, I'm thinking, what if these quotes have authors? Usually quotes do. So, we could put it all in a string. We could add something like new line and put, whoever the author is. The author is me there. I said quote 1. Please do not plagiarize that profound quote. But quote 2 was Obama, so don't mix those two up. His quote's a little more profound. But so anyway, joking aside, we can do something like this, but it gets a little convoluted. It's not very clean. It'd be much better to start to think about modularizing the idea of having code that can be placed in different areas and can be broken apart so we can manipulate it in different ways. So the array is a good idea, but we essentially have a quote and an author, and they always correspond to each other. So when we have more than one type of, I'm just going to say it, more than one type of property that corresponds to the same object, it is, as I just said, it is an object. So we could essentially make an array of objects. So what that would look like is, there's object 1, and we just repeat these objects. And each of these objects has a quote property and an author property. Even without any quotes, but I guess I will, let's put in my profound quote, the quote 1. Now look how much more readable that is. This is definitely a good direction to go in. So for me, making an array of objects with the quote and the author is the best way to go about this. And just to foreshadow what we're going to be doing with this, and the reason why it's good to really know your data structures, is how are we going to access these quotes? We won't just say if this was all, if this was in var quotes. We wouldn't just say quotes of like index 0, for example, because that would give us the entire object. We wouldn't want that. We would want quotes index 0 of quote, because it goes in this array, finds the first index, we return this object, then it accesses the quote property. That will actually get us this string, which is what we want. So we would say quotes 0 / quote, quote 1 / author. So all this thinking and theorizing about what we are going to do is a really good way to begin building a project. That way you will run into less problems in the future. So now that I've kind of theorized about this and thought about it, it seems like it'll work pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and implement this structure. Now I already have a list of quotes that I will just paste in. Let's give us some more room here. these are, if you started to read these, you might recognize them. Yes, in this example we are doing a Game of Thrones quote machine because Game of Thrones has the best quotes around. So here's our quotes. It's just an array of quotes with a quote and author property. And I'm actually putting a third property here. I don't know all these quotes, so I'm putting this unknown property. And I might leverage that later for some extra functionality. That would be kind of a bonus video. I wouldn't worry about it too much for now, but it will be explained later, so I just want to kind of point that out for now. Definitely doesn't affect what we are doing though. We're going to go ahead and collapse these. So we have our quotes array. And the next thing we want to do now that we have this structure is we want to put a single quote on the window object. The window object, by the way, is the global object in the browser setting that for anything we declare that's not inside a scope or not inside a function, like this quotes right here, it will be available on the global object. And I can prove this if my console would pop up. Let me try refreshing the page. Here's our console. So I could type in quotes, and as you can see, I got this back. Because when you just type something in the console here, it looks for the variable in the window object, and we've already placed it up here. So that seems to be working nicely. So we're going to want a variable that just holds one quote that we can access. This is the quote that we are displaying. So I'm going to name this var displayed quote. And right now it won't be anything. I just want to declare it. This is going to be manipulated inside a function. Since the button we are eventually going to make is going to change this all the time, it seems like it makes sense that this would be a function that this button is calling, which handles this for us. So let's make a function. We'll call it update quote. And it won't take any parameters. It will just do this implicitly. So we want to grab a random quote from this quotes variable and add it to here. So the way we're going to do that is we need to find a random index number. The way to get a random index number is always going to be this kind of large manipulation of the math object. We do math.floor. We take the floor of math.random times the length of the quotes. That'll just give us a random number between 0 and the length of the quotes. So once we have that, we can use that index to access whatever random index we've come up with here. So let's just say displayed quote equals quotes of index, and we'll take the entire quote since we will manipulate and kind of organize the author from the quote later on. And let's just console log that as well to make sure we are getting something. Okay, so can I do clear here? Yes, I can. Great, so I should be able to type in update quote and invoke it, and we get back, looks like we get a random quote back. Let's update it again, and we get another one, both from Tyrion. And we get another one, yep. So it looks like we are getting, it seems to be favoring Tyrion. There's Lord Vars. Great, so we're indeed getting random quotes. That seems to be working. All is right with the universe. Now that we have that all set, we want to start thinking about how we are going to use this on the actual web page that we have. So this is a good time, since we have something that's functional, to experiment with how we are going to hook this in and make it usable from the user's point of view. So we're going to do a little bit of HTML. It's really just so we know that it is in fact working on the web page. There's really not going to be any styles. We just want to be able to output this in some environment other than the console. So we'll just add our body tag and close that now before I forget later. After that, we want to display a few things. We're going to want to have a spot for the quote, and we're going to want to have a spot for the author. So we'll just make two div elements with an ID for each of those. There's for the quote, but that is a div element. And an ID for the author. And there we go. Then of course, as we look back here, we want to have a button to generate these quotes, so I'll just throw in a button right now. And we'll call this a generator. Now, we can use this button, we can do something like onClick equals, and I think we can just write the function right there. That's a kind of an old HTML way of doing this, and I actually don't remember exactly how we do that because I never use this, to be honest. This kind of adds more, it obstructs the HTML code a bit, it makes it a little less clean. So we're going to use jQuery to actually access these elements and also put an event listener on here. That way everything we need to really write remains in the code. So for now, we will just have the button. We'll say new quote, and we'll close the button. So there's our button. Great. Of course, we want to now be able to add quotes in these div elements. It doesn't really do anything right now. So this is where we start to get jQuery in. And I have jQuery in the head here with this script tag. It's a CDN to jQuery. There'll be a link for it for you to add if you don't already have it. So since jQuery is loaded, we are going to want to add some event listeners. So I'll do this, which is this right here, $ within just a function, is the shorthand version of this. These two are exactly the same. This one's obviously it's a lot shorter, so I prefer that one. So we have, once the document is ready, we have this function, and in this function, we're going to want to add an event listener on the button, so we'll select it by its ID. .click. And this function will run our update quote. Alright, and right now, if we click this button, nothing is happening on our HTML, but something is happening down in our console. And that's because this button right here, the function that it's invoking is only outputting something to the console. There's nothing here that's actually manipulating anything on the DOM. So let's change that. We'll get rid of this console here, and inside this function we will select the HTML elements, and we will then add the new information. So this function will not just pick the quote, it will also update the DOM elements using jQuery. We just gotta have the ID on the DOM, and jQuery will do the rest. We'll select quote, HTML. This will set the inner HTML of this element, and we will just set it to quotes of the randomly generated index. And remember, this is where the data structure really comes in handy, because again, we don't want to output the whole object there, we just want to output the quote part. So we will then do, where was I here? Quotes of the index returns a single object, and on that object we want the quote property. Likewise, in the author tag, in the author ID, we will want the same quotes of the index and the author property. So now when we click new quote, we have this right here. Much nicer. And of course, let me just change the behavior real quick so I can just rerun this as I go. Where is, not autosave, auto update. Great. So I'm going to refresh this app. At the beginning, we have no quotes here. That doesn't look very good, so let's write in something to fix that. We just want to get a random quote and put it in here once the document loads. We've already built out some functionality. The document loading puts an event listener on the button, and now it will also just run this function update quote. So if we put this on the outside, this is just a standalone invocation of the function. It will just run it once. And in here, actually, we're making an anonymous function that invokes update quote. We can just put in update quote. It's exactly the same thing. It's getting an already declared function, and it's invoking it when it's clicked. And we also invoke it right when the document loads. So now if we run, we see that we have indeed a quote loaded right at the beginning, which looks very nice, and we can generate new quotes. Now, something's happening here, if you haven't noticed yet, and that is that sometimes, as I click, we get the same quote. And right now I have a bunch of quotes commented out and just these two, so it can demonstrate that. Between these two quotes, we get a lot of repeats. Right now, this function is not very smart. With an array of index 0 and 1, and we are displaying index 0, it's going to look at the function and then give back either a 0 or a 1. And it doesn't care if we already have a 0, it's just being told to get a random number between 0 and 1 and return it. It doesn't matter what happened beforehand. So we're going to need to have some functionality to keep track of what is currently on the DOM. And the best way to do that is to keep track of it in its own variable in the JavaScript that corresponds to what we are doing. So I'm just going to keep track of the index. I'm going to call it current IDX. And at the end here, we will set current index to whatever index we picked. So as we refresh the quotes, we also refresh the index. And what we will do now is use a do while loop to repeat this line of code right here. What this essentially does is it keeps repeating this until we have a new index that is different from the current index. So I'll have in the while condition, as long as current index is equal to index, we are going to just run this again, try to get another number, try to make one different than the current index. Now, a word of caution, if the index only has one value, if the array only has one index, this will be an infinite loop, so make sure that doesn't happen. Now that we have that, we can refresh the app. And now we are alternating between each quote back and forth. As you can see, we now have some functionality, some logic built in to keep us from repeating the same quote. Cool.